Well, Moses, the story that I want us to share today, illustrates that very perfectly. Moses, the greatest leader in Old Testament history and in all of human history, even regarded by secular historians as one of the great leaders of all time, was a man who did not think himself qualified for that leadership. When God called Moses, Moses was a murderer who was a fugitive from Pharaoh. You remember the story? He was a Hebrew who had been adopted by Pharaoh's daughter and raised in the palace. But one day Moses was out among the Hebrews and he saw an Egyptian taskmaster mistreating one of his own people. And Moses was enraged, and before he knew it, he had killed the Egyptian. And like the Boston murderer who was caught this week, Moses was at the top of the most wanted list to Pharaoh. Went to a little out-of-the-way place called Midian. Met a man by the name of Jethro there. He got one of Jethro's daughters for his wife. But Moses had fallen from the palace of Pharaoh to watching sheep in the middle of nowhere. But God came to Moses and he says, Moses, take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. Moses, I am the God of your fathers, Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. I too have seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I've heard their crying just like you. And because of their slave drivers, I'm concerned about their suffering. I've came down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians, and I'm going to bring them out of the land into a good and spacious land. Moses, the cry of your people and the cry of my people have reached heaven. And Moses, I am sending you to Pharaoh and to bring my people out of Egypt. And Moses, knowing all of his shortcomings, all of his checkered past, says words that you and I might say to God sometimes, who am I that I should lead your people out of Egypt? In Moses' reasoning, he had three disqualifications. First of all, he was a fugitive. At the head of Pharaoh's most wanted list. He thought he would have a target on his back if he went to Pharaoh. Secondly, being raised in Pharaoh's palace, he thought the Israelites would not identify with him, and they would think, who is this blue blood? Who is this double agent who's coming out here to spy on us? And then Moses, thirdly, said, wait a minute, you got the wrong guy. I'm a good inside guy, but I can't speak. I can't put two words together. I've never been eloquent. I'm slow of speech. And God said, okay, Moses, I've heard all of your excuses, but I want to ask you one question. Who gave man the power to speak? I did. And Moses, I want to just say one thing to you. If you will go, I will be with you. Your brother Aaron has a slick tongue. He's not as smart as you. He doesn't know me as well as you do. But you tell him what to say, and he can say it. And Moses, when you and Aaron go, I'll be with both of you. And so, you know the rest of the story. Moses led his people out of slavery to the very entrance of the promised land over a long, frustrating period of 40 years. Folks, imperfect people can do God's work, but that work is not always easy. It's not always of short duration. But Moses stands as an example to all of us today that imperfect, flawed people can be great in God's service. You see, despite all the things that Moses thought disqualified him, there were three real things that did qualify him. And I want to suggest to you this morning that those same three things qualify you and me to do God's work. First of all, Moses saw a need, and with all of his heart, he wanted that need to be met. For years, he had been inside Pharaoh's palace, but he heard all of the inside talk about what a problem these Hebrews were, and he saw the prejudiced attitudes. The truth was they were an immigrant people, and they were resented, just like many of the immigrants are resented in our own country today. And though Moses had overreacted in killing the Egyptian, his anger at the treatment of his people was the very thing that qualified him before God. The very thing that made Moses angry made God angry. And that's the point. When we see the need that God sees, friends, and when we feel strongly about the things that God feels strongly about, this is the first qualification for doing God's work. God doesn't want people who can't get angry. God doesn't want people who can't cry. God doesn't want people who are unwilling to walk in other people's shoes. But when you can feel and when you can see and when you love as God loves, when your faith leads you to see a need and you feel strongly about that need, this is the first indication that God is calling you to do His work. Do you meet that qualification this morning? Have you got a heart as well as a head? To seeing all the oppression, all the poverty, all the discrimination, all of the hatred, all of the war in the world upset you? Then I say you qualify for God's army. Secondly, when Moses saw a need, he identified himself with that need. Moses made the decision to identify with God's people who were suffering rather than to enjoy the luxury and the peacefulness of the palace. So in the burning bush, God confirmed to Moses that he too had seen the misery of his people in bondage. Moses, what you have seen and what you have felt about the situation, I have seen and I have felt. Moses, take off your sandals, for the ground on which you're standing is holy ground. Moses, you've been standing with me, and you've been standing with my people. Moses, I need you because you do have a heart for oppressed people. Moses, even though you've enjoyed luxury for 20 years since you were rescued down by the Nile River by the Pharaoh's daughter, you still know that you are a Hebrew, and you still know that the God of your fathers, of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, is more important than enjoying the luxuries of Pharaoh's palace. This is the second qualification, friends. The second qualification is to surrender to God and to identify with God's people and God's purpose. There's lots of important things to do in this world, but nothing is more important. Nothing is even compares in importance to doing God's purpose. Thirdly, when we first see the need that God sees, and secondly, when we identify with that need and are willing to respond to it, then we have the third qualification. It's only then, when our heart and our affections are what they ought to be, that God can qualify us. Only in that third step is God concerned about what too oftentimes we're concerned about at the beginning. We need to get our hearts right. We need to get our heads right, and then God can supply the rest. We surrender to God's purpose by becoming engaged in what God calls us to do.